Imagine you're at a high school reunion. You're standing near the punch bowl, which, let's be honest, has something stronger in it by now, and you start counting. You notice that more than half the people in that room are either divorced, going through one, or quietly considering it on the drive home. And these aren't 20-somethings figuring out who they are. These are people in their 40s and 50s, people who built lives, raised kids, bought furniture together. People who, statistically speaking, should have had this whole relationship thing figured out by now. So what's happening? Why is Gen X, that scrappy, self-reliant generation sandwiched between the boomers and the millennials, quietly leading one of the most significant divorce waves in modern history? And more importantly, what does psychology tell us about why? Let's talk about it. First, a little context, because the numbers are genuinely surprising. While overall divorce rates in the United States have actually been declining since the 1980s, researchers at Bowling Green State University found something fascinating. Divorce among adults over 40 has roughly doubled since 1990. They call it gray divorce, though honestly, Gen X bristles at that term. This generation doesn't do gray anything quietly. What's happening here isn't just a demographic blip, it's a psychological story, decades in the making. To understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of their marriages, the beginning of them. Gen X grew up in the 1970s and 80s, and here's what that means in real psychological terms. They were the first generation to grow up watching divorce happen in real time, at scale, in their own homes. The divorce rate peaked in the United States around 1980. These kids were in elementary school. They were sitting at kitchen tables while their parents split the silverware. They were shuffled between apartments and told to be strong. And because the cultural script back then had no language for childhood emotional processing, most of them just adapted, quietly, independently, alone. Psychologists call this the development of an avoidant attachment style, and if you grew up in a chaotic or emotionally unpredictable home, there's a good chance your nervous system learned a very specific lesson. Don't need too much from other people, because people leave. You get good at self-sufficiency. You get good at irony and deflection, classic Gen X armor. You build an identity around not needing to be saved. And then you get married. Here's where it gets interesting, because the very psychological armor that helped you survive your childhood can quietly sabotage your most intimate adult relationship. Research on attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and later expanded by Sue Johnson and others, tells us that avoidant individuals tend to pull away when emotional closeness peaks, not because they don't care, but because closeness at a neurological level activates old alarm systems. The brain that learned love is unsafe doesn't just forget that lesson because you're wearing a wedding ring. So what does this look like in a real marriage? It looks like the partner who shuts down during arguments. It looks like the spouse who jokes when their partner cries. It looks like two people who are technically present in a marriage but emotionally miles apart, and both of them wondering why they feel so profoundly alone together. That's not a character flaw. That's neuroscience wearing a flannel shirt. But the story doesn't end there. Because Gen X didn't just bring childhood wounds into their marriages, they also arrived at midlife carrying something else entirely, a reckoning. Psychologists have long documented what Erik Erikson called the generativity versus stagnation crisis, the midlife stage where human beings instinctively ask themselves, is this the life I actually want? For most people, this hits somewhere between 40 and 55, and for Gen X, it's hitting with particular force for a very specific reason. This is the generation that was told to be practical, get a stable job, don't be dramatic. Their parents' generation chased security. Millennials got the self-actualization narrative from the start, but Gen X, they got mixed messages. They were teenagers during the Just Do It era and adults during the economic crash of 2008. They wanted meaning and settled for stability, often telling themselves they'd figure out the deeper stuff later. Well, later arrived. And for many Gen X individuals, especially women, research consistently shows that midlife audit is brutal in its honesty. Studies published in the Journal of Marriage and Family have found that women initiate approximately 70% of divorces, and the reasons they cite aren't dramatic. They're quieter than that. Emotional disconnection, feeling unseen, a slow, creeping sense that the person they became inside their marriage is not the person they actually are. That's not Hollywood. That's existential. There's a term therapists use that I think is worth sitting with: emotional divorce. This is what happens long before the legal paperwork. It's the moment someone stops trying to bridge the gap. They stop arguing because they stop caring enough to argue. They start building a parallel inner life, new friendships, new interests, new dreams that their spouse knows nothing about. By the time Gen X couples walk into a lawyer's office, many of them have been emotionally divorced for years. The legal divorce is almost a formality, a closing ceremony for a marriage that quietly ended somewhere around the second Obama term. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. For a generation that prided itself on toughness, divorce is often experienced as a profound identity crisis. Because if you spent decades building a life around a partnership and that partnership dissolves, then who are you? The psychological term for this is enmeshed identity loss, and it's particularly acute for Gen X men who were socialized to anchor their identity in provider roles, and for Gen X women who poured themselves into caregiving, often at the expense of their own development. What the research tells us, and what I find genuinely hopeful, is that this identity crisis, as painful as it is, can also be a doorway. Psychologist James Hollis, who has written beautifully about midlife transitions, argues that the dissolution of a constructed identity isn't a failure, it's an invitation. The self that emerges on the other side of that dissolution is often more authentic, more intentional, more alive than the one that went in. Gen X divorcees, interestingly, tend to reinvent themselves with real ferocity. Studies on post-divorce adjustment show that adults who divorce in midlife report higher life satisfaction within 3 to 5 years, particularly when they engage in what researchers call self-expansion, new skills, new relationships, new ways of understanding themselves. This generation, the one that figured out the internet without instructions, that learned to survive latchkey childhoods and economic recessions, turns out to be remarkably resilient when they decide to stop merely surviving and start building something that actually fits. That's not a small thing. That's actually extraordinary. So if you're Gen X, or you love someone who is, and you're watching a marriage strain or fracture or quietly come apart, I want you to hear this. The psychology behind what you're experiencing isn't weakness, and it isn't failure. It's the convergence of a complicated childhood, decades of emotional adaptation, a midlife reckoning that is developmentally normal, and a growing refusal to live inauthentically. That's not a character flaw. That is, in the deepest sense, human. What matters now is what you do with the awareness, because awareness is the whole game. The attachment wounds that drove disconnection can be healed. Therapy, particularly emotionally focused therapy, has remarkable outcomes for couples willing to do that work. The identity loss that feels like free fall can become, with time and intention, liberation. And the reckoning, that uncomfortable, unavoidable midlife question of, is this really it, is not an ending, it's a beginning, if you let it be. Gen X grew up being told to figure it out, and you know what? For better or worse, they usually do. If this resonated with you, whether you're living it, have lived it, or love someone who is, I'd genuinely love to know your thoughts in the comments. What part of this hit closest to home? Because the more we talk about this stuff honestly, the less alone any of us feel in it. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology of relationships, identity, and the beautiful mess of being human, subscribing means we can keep having these conversations together. See you in the next one.